right, here we go. We're starting. Little awkward pause there on our end.
I didn't know where I thought you were waiting on me for something.
Awkward.
It's always hard to, like, how
Jump
do you
right
start?
in, yeah.
Just jump right in. Just say, something.
Yeah.
But
Didn't
hello.
Didn't we once say that you were going to have something? Maybe that was the ending.
Yeah,
Well,
beginning or ending.
a beginning or something,
The
but
scripted
yeah.
thing never,
No.
it did not flow well.
You're not a scripted guy, man.
No. Let's go, off the cuff. Here we are. Welcome in, GPS the Guide. Glad that all of you are here watching or listening. Make sure you interact with us. We wanted to hear from you, and we're going to reiterate why we need to hear from you here in just a second. But check out the website, gpstheguide.com. Email us, mailroom@gpstheguide.com. You can find us on Instagram. We want to hear from you because Life Hacks, December 7th, we are going to record an episode with Life Hacks, some that you may have seen somewhere and you want us to test out for you. Send those to us. Send us a message on Instagram or mailroom@gpstheguide.com. Email us, Life Hacks. We'll test them out, whatever you want to see. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, if we have to buy a lot of stuff, probably ain't going to happen. Not going to happen. But if it's pretty cheap and, low cost, we will test that out for you. And we will, whoever sends us the life hack, we will say who sent it in, what they like. Yeah. You're going to get a little airtime, too.
Give them their credit.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Send us your phone number. We may call you while we do it, and you can be part of the action.
That is a service we can provide.
Absolutely. So, Life Hacks, December 7th. We need your ideas before then. So, please help us out, because if not, we got to leave it up to Ryan to come up with all these ideas.
And then
which might be good.
It could be very entertaining.
It would be very entertaining.
It'll be let's make fun of Ryan Day.
Well, that's every day.
I know. So what's new?
Yeah. Speaking of entertaining, let's get straight to the introductions because we have some special guests with us today. Daniel Sanders, Stefano Patterson, Ryan Gotro, and he's a little crowded at his end of the table. We have two special guests with us. I mean, let's not oversell it. But we have with us Mr. Joe Bruce and Miss Yvonne Bruce. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
Well, we are excited for what is coming up, and we know all of you will enjoy this as well. But Joe and Yvonne have a great story to tell, and we're just going to jump right in. I mean, there's no need to tease this one, fellas.
It's not.
Got the popcorn on this one.
Not at all. But
roll right into it.
Let's start in the here and now. How long have you two been married? You didn't know it was going to be a tough question.
He said, "Do what?"
He's getting testing us right off the bat.
21 years.
21 years.
Awesome.
Doesn't
Love
look
it.
I mean, they don't look 21 years old.
No.
No, they don't.
That's as good as the compliments get. I'm sorry.
There you go. We'll take it. We'll take it.
21 years. So I guess let's start with, how did you two meet? How did that come about?
Okay. Well, our stories
don't be shy, Yvonne. I see you poking him.
She immediately went, "Hey, that's yours."
She gave him the nudge.
Our stories don't match. That's the reason why she's giving me the nudge there. We're both been missionaries for many years, so that's the reason I guess you invited us here, and so we'll start there. My family and I went as missionaries with the International Mission Board, and first of all to Honduras in Central America. And we served there, planting new churches, and I worked with the literature ministry and a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, after about 10 years there, I was asked to become part of the area administrative team, and that team was in Guatemala.
What year was it when you first went to Honduras?
I went to language school in 1971.
You remember that year, Fano?
1971. I was not born in 1971.
I remember that year very clearly.
Thank you.
That's what I thought.
Thank you. Close. Close.
So we've been around a while. So then after about 10 years, in 81, I became part of the area administrative team, as I mentioned, and went to Guatemala. And that's where my family and I met Yvonne. She was there as a single missionary. And I'll let her tell you about that part, and then we'll catch our stories up after that.
So were you in Guatemala, is that where you...
Well, I started out as a journeyman in the Dominican Republic, And then about halfway through my term, I went to Guatemala. And then after I graduated from seminary, I returned. I worked in Guatemala. I was working in Christian education and teaching at our Baptist seminary there.
What year did you go to the Dominican Republic?
1969.
1969.
You guys weren't around either.
No.
No.
We're not.
Yeah.
What was the, how built up or how rural was the Dominican Republic at that time?
Well, Trujillo had been a dictator there for 30-some years, and he had just been killed. So when I was there, it was filled with American Marines and barbed wire fences everywhere.
Oh, wow.
So it was quite not what the DR looks like today, definitely.
I'm sure.
When I was home on one of my stateside assignments, I was asked to teach at my alma mater, California Baptist University. And so while I was there, I was teaching missions, trying to get young people excited about these unreached people groups. Well, as a teacher, of course, I assigned my students the homework of finding an unreached people group and researching it. And of course, as the teacher, I had to do the same thing. Well, I'm a blonde, and so we like things simple. And I went through the list and the names, and I mean, some of these unreached people groups, they start with a Q and an X and a W and a J, and you can't even pronounce it. So I started the A's, I went down the B's. I got down to the Dong, D-O-N-G. I could spell it, I could pronounce it, and I knew I could remember it because I used to tell people, my name is Yvonne, it rhymes with Avon, but I'm not the ding-dong lady. So in a very spiritual...
That's a T-shirt.
In a very spiritual way, I picked out this people group to begin to pray for and to research them. And in the meantime, I found out there was 3.1 million Dong people
Oh, wow.
in China, and they were foreigners because they'd just been there 3,000 years. and simulated into the culture yet. They lived high in the mountains, the lower Himalayas, from about 8,000 feet above. That's where they begin living and on up. But they live in very high mountain peaks that go up and down and up and down. And I guess the part that really got to my heart, I found a copy. Actually, it wasn't a copy because there wasn't any copies nowadays. It was a photograph of an old letter that someone had written in 1892, saying, we know there's people up in those mountains. We see the smoke. It's on a regular basis, so we know people live there. Would somebody come next year and share the gospel?
1892.
And
Wow.
this was in 1992, 100 years ago by, and nobody responded. And so through a series of events, God called me to go to China to work with the Dong people.
Wow.
So
That's
while
okay.
she was in China, my family and I were still in Guatemala. And in 98, a series of things took place with the International Mission Board, some administrative changes, and we were led to come back to the United States. And I started working with Texas Baptist in their missions department. And in the process, we got an invitation from a group in China to partner with them. And so the guy that I worked with and I were going to go over kind of on a survey trip. And I looked at him one day and I said, do you know anything about China? And he said, no. And he said, do you? I said, no. I said, but I know a lady that's serving over there. And I said, I'll see if I can get in touch with her. And maybe I knew she was living in Hong Kong and, having to go in and out. I said, maybe when we go through Hong Kong, she can meet us and kind of give us some orientation. And so I wrote to called the International Mission Board, and I said, can you give me the contact information for Yvonne Hilton is her maiden name? And they said, no, we can't do that. That's classified. And I thought,
So this was early 90s, correct?
Yeah.
And I mean,
Well, that's 98. Oh, yeah, my wife died. I forgot to say that.
well,
right after.
I mean, we don't want to just gloss over that. We're going to come back to that maybe a little more. But in the early 90s,
Yeah.
I mean, there were no internet, right? So is it letters and phone calls, and then you're calling the other side of the world, so time zone is a big deal. And
Right.
how easy was it to make contact doing those kind of things?
Well, we did have email and that kind of thing. But, I mean, wasn't quite in the dark ages, but almost.
So what year did you go to China?
92.
92. 92 is when you went.
Yeah, and then when we came home, and I'd only been here about a year, is when my wife passed away. And so, and in the meantime, then that's when we started this project with China, and we're trying to find her so we could get some orientation. And so, anyway, since IMB wouldn't give me her contact information, I just called some of our mutual friends in Guatemala and said, "Can you tell me how to get in touch with Yvonne?" They said, "Well, yeah, here's her email." And so, I mean, that's how classified things are.
Nice.
Anyway, so we were able to get in touch with her, and sure enough, when we went through, we met with her, and she gave us orientation, and she's been orienting me ever since.
Now, most people go to China and they buy these beautiful silk neckties. But Joe went to China, he just got his neck tied.
No, God used that reconnection there to kind of start up the friendship again, and so through email and phone calls we communicated, and then she came home for furlough for stateside assignment, and then we were able to spend some time together, and just felt like God was leading our lives together, and we ended up getting married 21 years ago, and it's been a happy ride so far.
That's a great synopsis. We're going to unpack
That's
some of that, I think, a
That's
little
an
bit.
exciting story.
Joe tells stories like we would. Here you go. Here's the high points. All right, let's move it on, people.
Next subject.
When you went to China, did you speak the language?
No, I did not. And the people group I was working with, they didn't either. So at least we had something in common with them. The Chinese language is 4 tones. The Cantonese language is 7 tones. But the people group that I was going to work with was 15 tones.
Wow.
It's the most tonal known language with no grammatical patterns. And everybody's going to look at me and like, what is a grammatical pattern? Well, let me tell you.
Please, yes.
A grammatical pattern is like, this is a book, this is a house, this is this, and you can put another noun into it. That's a grammatical pattern. Their language, because they had lived in so much isolation, was basically catchphrases. And so you would, sort of like, we have all these slang little phrases. Well, that's the way their language was, so there was not a pattern. You couldn't substitute in, like we say, got it. Well, you can't substitute something else in for that because that's the phrase. And so their language...
it's like speaking in movie quotes all the time.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good illustration of your movie quotes.
Wow.
And so I remember telling God, are you sure about this? And because, I was not young anymore, and, having already served almost 20 years with the board, I'd been around a little bit. And so learning a new language was quite a challenge. But what actually happened is God's smarter than us, of course.
Right.
Thank goodness. I mean, my goodness.
I thought he was going to send one little blonde over to the mountains by myself, and something was going to happen. But as God was calling me, he was stirring among the nations. And I say the nations because my team ended up being from 9 different nations, speaking 7 different languages, from 8 different sending organizations.
Wow.
And so our team God just brought us together. In that time, in 92, there was no internet. We didn't post, hey, we're going to do this. Y'all want to come, know? But God was, in his way, in his wisdom, he was knocking on people's hearts and stirring them. And in ways that I couldn't even try to imagine, he brought us together as a team. We never really got together as a team because we couldn't get together. But he brought us together as people. And we were able to, as a team, make the parts of the New Testament in their language. It's not written because they don't read. It's an oral language. And we also have the Jesus film, which is exactly the book of Luke. It's also in their language as well. And so that was the big things that we were working on, trying to make the gospel available to them.
What were the laws in China at that time as far as evangelizing to
No.
as a Christian?
No, you can't do it.
So, same as today.
Yeah, same as today. No,
Nothing's
you can't do
changed.
it. Except my people group, we're high in the mountains. We're in what they call an autonomous region. And autonomous to them means basically you don't bother us and we won't bother you, meaning you have no roads, no electricity, no schools, no hospitals, no anything. You don't bother us up in those mountains, and just don't exist. And they're foreigners anyway. I mean, 3,000 years, of course you're a foreigner.
Were they accepting of you coming in
No.
since they were so
No,
isolated and
No.
all that good
No.
stuff? How
no, not at all.
how long did it take for y'all to kind of
Well,
establish that rapport with them? And,
like I say, we were a team, but we never got together as a team. We were individuals doing different things. And so we had, like some of our team members actually put in a chopstick factory making chopsticks, the disposable kind out of bamboo. And they were Korean.
okay.
And so they looked more like, I just dropped these.
No, that's all right. Can't break it. They're cheap.
They look more like Asians than you might realize I looked. And we had others on our team that were Asians that had a lot more of accessibility, but the language barrier was huge. The only people that really learned the language very well at all, remember I mentioned that Cantonese is 7 tones? Mm-hmm. So my 7-tone Cantonese speakers were closer to learning the language. Even though the Chinese speakers that spoke just 4 tones, they still couldn't distinguish all the different tones and sounds. And so that's why it was quite complicated.
Okay.
That's a lot of people say Cantonese is one of the hardest languages to learn today, and it's twice as hard or twice as many tones as that. Wow.
That's ridiculous.
That is.
So they were 8,000 feet up or so in the mountains
high in
where
the
they
mountains.
started. How far away did you all stay?
Well, the first time I went in to see my people group, we flew in as far as we could fly. We got on a bus, we got on a train and went as far as the trains would go. We got on a bus as far as the bus would go. We went as far as a little tiny bus would go, and then we got in a boat and we started up the rivers. And the rain came down, and the floods came up, and the rains came down. We traveled for 3 weeks, and I never saw one of my people group.
Wow.
And that's when I realized how isolated they were. You don't bump into them. You don't go at the wrong time of the year. You don't go by the map on how to get there. By the map, it looked like this way would be an easier way to get in. And the man leading us in, he assured us he knew how to do it, but he was wrong.
Oh, wow.
I saw some smoke on the mountain one time. I think I can get there.
Let's keep going that way.
And so we
keep
found
going
out
up.
you had to go through a different province entirely, so you're coming down on them instead of going up to them. And so it was quite. It took about a week to get in. They were isolated. They weren't going to just hear the gospel by turning on their televisions and hearing the gospel. That somebody had to go, and we had a group of people that were willing to make that commitment. There's 3.1 million Dong people, and so there's a lot of people that had never, ever in their life even had any notion of the name of God. And so praise God today, there's a thriving church. There's a bunch of believers that are sharing Christ.
That's awesome.
We've had the opportunity to, not only through her ministry in the Dong world, to get the Jesus film, the Jesus film, into the native language so they can understand it. But also part of our work in Central America was kind of looking to see where else we could maybe make a penetration for the gospel. And one day my associate and I were looking at the map and just kind of praying over it, and God just kind of laid Iceland and Greenland on my heart. And so, again, I went to the IMB administration. I said, do we have anybody that's working in Iceland and Greenland? And he said, no. And so we began to talk and pray about that, and the internet was just getting started. And so he was a little bit more proficient than I was, and I said, why don't you see if you can make some contact with some folks up there? And he did, and he came back, and there was a young guy working with YWAM, Youth with a Mission group. And he said, yeah, we'd be happy for you guys to come and see what the needs are. So he and I decided to go, and we got there. We went first to Iceland, and we met a young couple there, and were able to have some good conversation and got the groundwork established. And then we went on over to Greenland and met this young man, and they happened to be having a meeting of a group of pastors. And so we met with those, with that group. It was the first time I had reindeer stew. Anyway,
Reindeer stew.
we had reindeer
That sounds
stew.
delicious.
Would you try a bite, Fano?
Probably not.
Well,
Depends on how hungry.
over
Poor
in-
Rudolph. Poor
Yeah,
Rudolph.
no. I would have
Over-
sympathy for.
Over in Iceland, they fed me whale steak.
Well, steak.
But that's not very good either. It tastes kind of like liver.
Thought I'd be
anyway.
a little fatty.
Yeah, it was. So anyway, we were with this group of pastors, and that was back in the days when they were doing the Jesus marches. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember that or not, but
That was
Like-
in the 90s.
like in a group.
We remember the 90s. Ryan.
I was just a young pup.
It was,
Well, anyway,
barely.
there was kind of a movement among evangelical churches of all kinds. They would get together in a certain geographical area, and they would do what they called a Jesus march, and they would just march through their town, praying over the town and taking opportunities to share the gospel if God opened the door. And so they had already planned to do one in this little town where we were. And so we were walking along doing the Jesus march, and I looked over and I saw this other Anglo-looking guy, and I thought, well, he's kind of out of place here too. And so I started talking to him. I said, we started talking. I said, who are you and what do you do? And he turned out he was with Campus Crusade, the people who produced the Jesus film. And I said, well, what are you doing here in Greenland? And he said, we've got all the pieces together to put the Jesus film in the Greenlandic language. He said, we've got the speakers, we got everything else. And I said, what else you need? He said, $25,000. And so it turned out the governor of Greenland was going to be the voice of Jesus on the.
Oh,
That is awesome.
And so anyway, we began to talk and pray, and we came back and began to look at our budget. And because of the Lottie Moon Christmas offering and faithful giving of Southern Baptist, we were able to find that amount of money, and were able to get the Jesus film in Greenlandic.
wow.
And you say, well, that's a big deal. There are only 30,000 of them. But the issue is that most of the year it's dark.
Right.
In the wintertime, it's just dark. And so alcoholism is a major problem. And so one of the reasons why they were interested in getting the Jesus film was they said in the wintertime, if they've got, say, they watch anything. I mean, what do you do? I mean, you can't do anything else. And they said, we can put a copy of the Jesus film in every home in Greenland if we only had it. And so through that, Southern Baptists were able to have a part in helping to put the Jesus film
Wow.
in the hands of the people in Greenland.
We're worried when daylight savings time goes away.
Right?
I know. Can't
They're
imagine.
like, that's every day. It's dark.
Do you speak Greenlandic?
No,
Okay.
no.
Do they speak English there at all? Or?
Well, some do. I mean, it was a Danish, a province of Denmark.
Okay.
And since they, we couldn't buy it because it still belongs to Denmark. anyway, that's neither here nor there.
So Yvonne, you went to China in 1992. When did you come back to the States? What year?
I married him in 2001.
So how long had you been in the States when you all got married, I guess?
6 months.
Oh, wow.
Hey, when you're our age,
Not
you don't
really.
waste time.
What's ever wait?
So almost 10 years in China.
Yeah.
Language-wise, I'm captivated by people who can learn a new language.
Yeah.
What language? I mean, the Dong people, you're trying to learn their language as best you
Right.
could. Were you also having to learn Chinese or
Yes,
Cantonese?
yes. I went to Beijing and I studied 6 days a week, 8 hours a day for 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just, a little bit of time into it.
Slightly.
And I want to tell you how good I am. About after the first year, the teacher was passing out these papers, and she put a paper in front of me, and I looked, and just nothing looked familiar. It's awful. And I'm just sweating because none of the characters made sense. And she said, "You have the paper upside down."
That's something I would do. Oh, my
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah, and another time I was looking at a thing and I said, "This looks so familiar, but I can't remember what it is." She said, "That's your name." So, I was really good at the characters. They were really easy for me to learn and memorize.
It's not, obviously, I don't know Chinese or Cantonese, but just such a different writing style that, it doesn't make sense when I see it in a movie or whatever I'm watching. It's like, what does that mean? It might as well be hieroglyphics to me,
Oh, yeah.
Well, it is a type of hieroglyphics.
Yeah,
It's
I'm
a
smarter
sort of-
than I thought.
Yeah,
See?
it's sort of a sophisticated hieroglyphics. That's a good description.
Look at
But
that. Didn't even
I'm
know
like
it.
you. I'm blown away for anybody that can learn a different
Yeah. So
language and speak
you
it,
already
write
speak
it, and all that
Spanish?
stuff.
Yes.
when you went to China?
Yes. Yeah, I'd already been in Guatemala 17 years. So,
Yeah.
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 But it's neat how God works because after we got married, He opened the door for us to serve together in Cuba. And so,
Before we get there, hold on. Before we get there, what was it like? So you don't have to answer this, but how old were you when you got married?
I was 53.
53 years old. You had not been married before,
Not been
correct?
married. Been a single missionary for 27 years. I was confirmed maid. I used to tell people, I'm going to get married whenever the Pope proposes.
She never
I
got
love it.
stationed in Italy though, so
I love it.
Yeah, so,
or Vatican City, I guess.
Right?
yeah. So I was very surprised.
What was that like being an older person, used to being single, used to being on your own, to get married at in your 50s for the first time ever?
Well, right after we got married, we went back to China, and as we were getting ready to go through customs, our guest who had been through customs, he said, "Hand me your passport." And I said, "I'm not going to hand you my passport. I'm responsible for my passport." And I had always preached that you're responsible for your passport. If you lose your passport, you've got to go to Beijing. You'll be there 5 days. Da 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 da. And so it was a few years before I trusted him with my passport.
in fact, we just got back from a trip, and I asked her if she wanted her passport, and she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable with me holding on to it."
Oh, that's great.
That's funny.
There obviously were major adjustments that you had to make, but anything else that comes to mind quickly that you could share with someone who may be going through the same thing? They're older
Well-
and they're getting married for the first time.
Well, it was sort of funny because at our wedding, everybody that came were our friends. We didn't have a traditional wedding hardly at all because we sent out poems on the internet,
Okay.
and we said only family come, and then all these other people thought they were family, so they showed up.
we had all these MKs who came. And
Tell them
none
what
of-
an MK is.
An MK, missionary kids,
Okay.
had come, and one of them said, "Well, I know they always called us uncle and aunt, even though not any kind of blood relative." They said, "Well, I know Uncle Joe and Auntie Yvonne wouldn't mind if I come." And so they came, brought their kids and family. In fact, one of them, during the reception, one of their kids ran into the table and split their head wide open.
Yikes.
So anyway, that was neither there.
Well, I was just saying, though, that in a sense, even though we came from sort of two different worlds, we shared a world in common, which was really interesting. I was able to watch his daughters grow up. He has 3 beautiful daughters, and the youngest one, I guess, was 5 when they first came in. And he used to travel all the time because he was the area director, so he was always in the air. But his wife and I were really good friends, and so when he was gone, his wife and I would do things together. When he came home, she didn't need me. So I hardly knew him. But I did have the opportunity, so I think it was really special that his daughters and I had already had a long-term,
That's
very
neat.
long-term relationship.
It's really neat.
In fact, I guess his younger daughter had been out in China with the group before that, and I'd just seen her a few months, before her mother died and everything. So the family relationship was already there. But one of our MKs was worried. They said, if Uncle Joe marries Aunt Yvonne, is that incest?
Oh my goodness.
That's great. God preparing you for something you didn't even know was coming.
Not on
For
my
sure.
plans.
Yeah.
All right, so we got that out of the way. Now you come back. You go to Cuba. What happens in Cuba?
Well, I was going to let her give you God's math.
Well, everybody wonders, Guatemala, China,
Mm-hmm.
and then Cuba. And I said, think about it. This is God's math. Spanish, communism, you put them together. Only one place in the world can you serve next. Cuba. And so I'm reminded over and over, God does not waste anything of our experiences. Everything that we've ever done, everything we've ever thought of doing, it seems like sometime in your life that's going to come back, and God's going to weave that back into your life to bring honor and glory to Him. And it just that's been so true in our lives that He weaved us together. But we do have an untraditional marriage. We only got married on a contract for 50 years. Into the 50 years, we're going to see if we want to go on and renew it for another 50 years, or do we want to go on and make it permanent? Tell him how old you'll
At
be.
the end of the 50 years, I'll only be 108.
You never know, Joe.
You never know.
Never
You
know.
never know, yeah.
You never know.
Well, my dad made it 96.
Never
I'm
know.
Modern medicine.
Yeah, there you
Right.
go. Yeah.
So Cuba, how long were you in Cuba?
almost 5 years and total. We
How much freedom do you have in Cuba? Because, I mean, it's...
we
I-
couldn't
I-
live there. Obviously, we lived in South Florida,
Okay.
and so we would go in 4 or 5 times a year.
Okay.
And we first tried just going in, just to be an encouragement to the churches. We related primarily to the churches, Baptist churches on the eastern side of the island. There's a mountain range right in the middle, and so back in the 1800s, the American Baptist and Southern Baptist came to an agreement that the American Baptists would work on the southern end, and the Southern Baptists would work on the western end over there, and because of the difficulty of travel. Well, it's not there anymore, and so there's kind of an intermingling of the two groups, a good close working relationship. Anyway, we worked with the ones on the east, and
The East meaning Guantanamo.
Yeah,
That's what most people
yeah.
understand is
Gotcha.
the East is Guantanamo Bay. We, of course, did not go to the Guantanamo Bay area, but we
Okay.
were on that side of the island.
Gotcha.
we went to Guantanamo City. There is a town called Guantanamo, and then the Bay part. I mean, the American base is just a little sliver down at the end there. How we got there was we were working with the internet with the missionary orientation training program at the IMB, and we'd been doing that for about 4 years. And every time we would go to the commissioning service, we'd look at each other and kind of not say anything, but there was always that question in our mind about could we do this again? And so we went back through the appointment process and everything, and had to go through the whole thing as if we were brand new. 20-something years of experience, both of us, but we still had to go through the whole thing because we were now married and had been out of the system long enough. We had to go through it.
Mm.
And so anyway, we were reappointed and went down to work on that end. And it was kind of like the icing on the cake for our missionary career, just to see what God was doing, because we were there right as the church growth movement was beginning to plateau. It had just been a tremendous growth of the church in Cuba, and we were able to see some of that and experience. It was just kind of like walking back into the Book of Acts to see the faith of the people and tell them about the lady with just finding the button.
I guess it was a pastor's retreat, and we were with one of the women, and we said, does anyone have a praise item? And this lady raised her hand. She said, I praise God. And she said, why? And she said, well, this morning my husband put on his pants and the button broke. And we don't have any buttons. And that's the only pair of pants he has. And so we just prayed. And she said, we were walking in the street, and I looked down, and there was a shiny button, and it just fit the hole. And she was praising the God for a button.
Wow.
Wow.
And I was so humbled to think of, you know, if our button comes off, we just grab another pair. You know, if something. And we have several stories. One of the ladies, her family had come to visit her, and they brought her a bar of Palmolive soap, and she was saving it for a special occasion because soap is it's just not available. And Palmolive soap, I mean, that actually has a smell to it. It doesn't smell like the kind of stuff they give them that smells like pig.
Oh, wow.
And so it does. It smells like pig. And
Lard base.
yeah. And so the church was going to have there'd been a horrible hurricane go across the island. And so the church was collecting things to give, and this church got together. They were gathering their resources and everything to go out to help the people. And the lady went up to the pastor, and she said, I don't have any money, but I have this bar of soap.
Oh, wow.
I've been saving it. And again, you're just so humbled because we think of a bar of soap. That's so common. And the whole team was so excited because they all got to share together the Palmolive soap.
Wow.
It's great.
Yeah.
I mean,
That
just
is.
totally different perspective.
Oh,
Oh, yeah,
completely.
for sure.
I told the story about Uganda and the kid with the stick, the toy stick. I told that story, a stick on wheels.
I don't remember
I
that.
don't remember you though.
So along the same lines of in America, how in a bubble we are, and third world countries, a lot of Americans can't really comprehend what that really means or what that is. But I was in Uganda, and we were eating lunch in this tiny little village, and I had a bag of Tootsie Rolls I took with me to give out to kids. So I was giving kids the can, and I gave it to a couple. We had a translator with us, and he said, gave it to a couple kids. They ran off, and our translator, Jimmy, he said, they're going to get the rest of the kids in the village. And a few minutes later, I mean, there's just dozens of kids there coming up one at a time, and I'd give them a Tootsie Roll, and they'd say thank you. And there was a kid there, and he had a stick just a couple feet long. On the bottom of it was another stick tied to it, and it had kind of like like an old spool from like a old thread or something, like little wheels, kind of like what do they call that? Lincoln Logs, like Tinker Toys, those kind of little things.
Yeah.
So he literally had a stick on wheels,
Oh, wow.
and that was his toy, and he was the king kid. Like he had the other kids would walk up to him and speak to him, and he'd nod his head, and they'd just put their finger on that stick. They got to touch it.
Wow.
And so Jimmy was telling us, he said his dad probably found those wheels or something, or did some work for somebody and got those wheels and made that. And he said none of the other kids have a toy. His toy is a stick on wheels.
That's crazy.
But
And my
like,
kid's complaining about not having 7 dresses.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
from Disney.com.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a total different mindset from a button or a bar of soap or a stick on wheels.
Tell
Yeah.
about the light bulb.
And just turning towards prayer. I mean, you're praying for a button. That's
And
just
being grateful for how God provides,
Of course.
and looking to Him to provide for the simple thing. We visited one of the young pastors out in the boondocks, and he was telling us about. He's all excited because he said, "I want you to see the new parsonage," and he took us over to this little lean-to thing that they'd built out of, like when you go to the sawmill, and they are sawing the log, and those first few swipes across, you just get the slag piece. That's what he'd collected, all of those. They let him have them, and that's what he'd built his house out of.
oh, wow.
And he said, but what I'm really proud of is the kitchen. And he took us into the kitchen, and he said, it was kind of dark in there, and he said, I wondered how I was going to make it light enough in here for my wife to be able to, do the kitchen work. And he said, we were able to get electricity, and he said, look, here's my little, how we got electricity. And so he took me to show me one of the little outlets, and it was just a piece of plywood, a little plywood box, and over the front of it was a piece of cardboard with two little holes and a bare wire sticking out.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
So he said, we've got electricity in the house. But he said, I was wondering how I was going to fix that, that light in there. And he said, I finally got a light bulb, but he said I didn't have anything to put it in. So he said, I went out to burn the trash one day, and he said, I was looking around, and he said, I saw this thing, and he said, that would be just about the size I need for that, to screw the light bulb in. You know what it was? It was like a band roll-on deodorant, that little thing where the ball goes.
Oh, my goodness.
So he took that little place where the ball was, and he tacked it on it was just a piece of kind of like a sapling he'd cut and put across it. He tacked it on there, ran those bare wires over to it, and dropped them down in, and screwed the bulb right up to it. And when she wanted light, she'd tighten it up.
Wow.
But he was so
That
proud.
is amazing.
So proud of his invention. One of the pastors was telling us about they'd had an evangelistic revival, and this guy had become a Christian. His wife had been a believer for a while, but not him, because he was in the military. And of course, the military couldn't identify with an evangelical church group. That would just be unheard of. But anyway, now he'd just retired, and he'd started coming to church with his wife, and he'd come to know the Lord as his Savior. And so he wanted to be baptized. And so they had a big baptismal service, and so the pastor said he had baptized some people, and then this guy baptized him, and the soldier went on up, out of the water and was up on the bank. And so the pastor finished baptizing the rest of the people that had, were there to be baptized. And then he started up out of the water, there's a river, out of the water up the bank. And the soldier was there, reached down to grab his hand and help him up. And he said when he got up there, the soldier said, Pastor, I need to talk to you. And the pastor said, well, look, he said, I'm soaking wet. He said, let me change clothes and then we can talk. And he said, no. He said, what I've got to say can't wait. And he said, well, okay, what is it? And he said, the guy stood at attention and saluted. And he said, Pastor, he said, for 20 years, he said, I've served in the secular army. I know what it is to give orders and take orders. And he said, now I'm ready to serve in the Lord's army. Tell me what to do.
Oh, wow.
Love it.
Mirrors a story in the Bible very closely.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does.
Wow.
What was it like working as a married missionary? You had spent your whole career as a single missionary. What was it like now working as a married missionary?
Well, we worked together as a team. I don't know how that happened, but it seemed like immediately we just sort of fell into place. I guess I've always been a part of a team, and so he became my teammate.
He just never went home.
Yeah,
Right.
He was my boss, and now
Stayed
he's
there.
my teammate. And so I guess that was pretty easy actually, because like I say, I'd known him, of course, in a whole different way,
Right.
but I knew who he was, and I knew his personality and everything, and so we just became a team. And people asked, what did we do in Cuba? Because we were only there part of the time. But in Cuba, we did outside everything that people couldn't do inside. An example was, there's not a Bible bookstore. You can't go buy a Bible in Cuba. And so to get a Bible, we had some printed. Of course, to have them printed, we had them printed in Korea, shipped to Mexico, then to Colombia, to come into Cuba,
Wow.
And then they were distributed by the government again. But everything you did was 9 steps more.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we tried to do was make materials available to the believers and to the leaders. We were basically trying to help support the seminary and the pastors and the convention to have them have materials available. And so those are the kinds of activities we were doing outside. I mentioned one hurricane. Seemed like every hurricane loves Cuba. They just go across it all the time.
Got a magnet on them.
Yeah. And so several times we were able to, physically fill up a ocean container and ship into Cuba and things like that the Cubans themselves couldn't do. So it was a very different role, because usually we use the word incarnate, which means body. We talk about the incarnation of Jesus, and that as missionaries we feel like we are the incarnate of Christ, that we are physically walking among the people, where in Cuba we were physically walking in a different way, but everything we were doing was to help support them, because inside they didn't have any resources. I can't tell you how many times we've been to the store with lots of money in our pocket, and we left the store with lots of money in our pocket, but very little on the shelf.
So after Cuba, what was next? Did you all serve somewhere else, or was that the last spot?
Well, then we came to Parkway,
Okay.
and we lived in the missionary house, and then we were there for 4 months, I guess, 3 or 4 months. And our plan, we hadn't planned to retire when we did, but my dad was a pastor up in Kentucky, up in his 90s, and his wife passed away, and we felt like
Wife number 3.
Yeah,
he outlived 3 women.
Oh, wow.
So
Impressive.
anyway, I felt like it was my turn to do some family duty. I'd been gone all these years, and my siblings had, stepped up and allowed me to be able to do what I felt like God was calling me to do. So I felt like it's time for us to do that. And so we came, and I said, Dad, we love you, but we can't live in that little town where you are. But,
No way.
We'll live in Nashville and be, available.
Yvonne had been in the mountains of China eating
Yeah.
up. The
No
mountains
way.
of Kentucky.
Enough of that rural
They've
life.
got 2 stoplights now.
Hey.
They used to just have 1.
So
Nice.
And nobody knows how many, what the syllables and stuff are, how many there are in Kentucky.
Right.
Still figuring that
when
out.
we go
Yeah.
to Missouri, I still have to translate for it.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I'm from California,
But anyway, we were looking for a place to stay, and Parkway's house happened to be available for 3 months. So we said, well, we'll live there 3 months, and then we worked with another couple of churches in the area, and we had it worked out where we had a year's furlough coming. And so we said, well, we'll live there a while, and then we'll live in these other, and we'll figure out where we want to be. Well, while we were here, we found the place where we are out in Hendersonville, Gallatin area, and went ahead and bought it, and we tried 2 or 3 churches out there, and we'd look at each other and say, that's not quite it. And so we ended up coming back to Parkway, and in the process, we felt like God was leading us and some other folks to start the ESL ministry. And so that's where we've dedicated a good bit of our time, and then out of that grew the Pan de Vida Sunday school class. And so that's pretty well where we've been focused.
Well, that answered my next question. We don't know what anyone does when they retire, because we're not there yet. But my question was going to be, what does a missionary do when they retire?
Start a booming Sunday school class.
Well, we're sort of unique in the fact that we're retired, but our middle daughter and her husband, they're missionaries in Italy. And so we, of course, as grandparents, sacrificially have to go to Italy very frequently.
Wow.
It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it.
That
So
must
rough.
be
So
be terrible.
rough.
That must be absolutely terrible.
I hate that for y'all.
I know, I can tell that. And so we have every year, unless they come here, we go to Italy. We usually stay about a month. We don't stay with our kids that long because we're still speaking, But, but we go and we stay a few days, and then we take off to another country, and give them a break. Then we go back and harass them again and go back and forth that way. But that way, especially when the kids were little, they sort of forget who you are, so you go and you greet them. Then you leave, and they come back. They're all excited to see you because they remembered you from last week, And so anyway, that's been our privilege. And so now we have 2 of our missionary daughters, or granddaughters, are in college here in Tennessee. It's one's at Union, the other one's at Carson Newman. And so we're sort of in the middle. So we're sort of the home base for our granddaughters as well, because we do understand the importance for the missionary children to feel like they have a home in America. So we've tried to sort of create that home for them, and so that's one of our responsibilities. we also, because we have been so much we're very much part of the missionary retiree group. We have a group that meets here in Tennessee. But every time anybody needs a crisis, even though he's not been their boss for how many years, they still call him for advice, for information, for everything. It's so funny there. I say, you should know what, would you tell Richmond this and that? And so even though he is no longer officially that's what he still does. And so we're amazed at how many years later they still think of him as their boss. I don't, but many of the people he worked with, they still call him boss.
Well, I'm glad God brought you two together, because if not, these month-long trips in Italy, she'd be chasing the Pope trying to get that engagement.
Right? Yeah. Constant chase. Yeah.
Well, Joe, Yvonne, thank you both so much for coming. And
thank you.
We know we can't cram a lifetime of experience and stories into an hour, but we did pretty well, I think. So thank you for coming, sharing some stories, sharing your life, and it was great.
I do have one thing. Like, what advice would you give? Because I didn't know anything about a mission trip until I actually went on one. So what advice would you give to someone that has never gone on a mission trip and just is thinking about going on a mission trip? What would you say to them before they went on that?
Well, a lot of clubs, you have to do orientation or initiation to be a club member. I think church membership ought to include a mandatory mission trip somewhere, because it does open your eyes. Mm-hmm. You will see parts of God's world that you've never seen before, and you will experience the family of believers in a whole new way. You'll realize that language and skin and eye shape and everything else that you've worried about has no significance in the family of God. And I heard someone say recently, with love, language is not a barrier. And I feel like everybody should have that opportunity.
Yeah. And I would add, you will never take the Lord's Supper the same way again. Because as you take the Lord's Supper, you remember he instituted this with his disciples. And from then on, believers have been doing that same thing, remembering until he comes back. And when you've been with another group of believers that has a different language, different culture, different look from you, and you realize one of these days we're all going to be around the table. And it's going to be like a big, long chain all the way from Jesus' day till he comes back again. And I'm just one of them, and I'm holding here and holding there. And it just changes your whole perspective on what it means to be part of God's family.
All right, Ryan, you got one for us today?
I do. I have one. So I am in 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. Rejoice always, praise without ceasing. Give thanks to all in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Jesus Christ for you. Love that.
Well, Joe, Yvonne, thank you again. We know you have plenty more stories. We may have you on again to come tell some stories, but
maybe next time we just tell stories.
That's
it. Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Well,
Fit right in around here.
Sign them up. Put them on the calendar, boys.
Yeah,
Deal.
Book it.
But thank you all for listening. We will see you all again next week. We love you. God loves you more. That's it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to GPS to God. Please leave us a rating on your podcast app and also subscribe on YouTube. Hit the bell if you would like to receive notifications when new episodes air.